Welcome to another episode of Making Browser Games, and I wanted to spend this video making another game project, but I realized to do so there's one other concept that I haven't taught yet that we really will need, and that's the concept of loops. So I'm going to make this video pretty short. A loop is essentially a way of taking code and repeating it, making it run multiple times without actually rewriting the code. And here's a simple way to see why that's needed. Let's say I task you with printing the numbers, and when I say printing, I mean console.log, logging the numbers 1 to 100 to the terminal over here. To do that, you would probably start with a counter. Counter is equal to 1, and then you would log the counter, console.log counter. I'm just going to call it printing from now on. Most other programming languages call this printing or printing out. I'm just going to refer to it as that. So I'm going to print out counter, and then I'm going to increment counter by saying counter plus equals 1, which is just a shorthand. I'm not sure if I already showed you this, but that's just a shorthand for adding 1 to a variable. You could also do counter plus plus, which is another shorthand for adding 1 to a variable. So if I were to take this code and copy and paste it, it would eventually add up to 100 because we print it out, we add 1, print it out, add 1. So to fulfill that task of printing the numbers 1 to 100, I could just start pasting all of this code here. Now, you can see why this is incredibly tedious and really bad programming practice. Completely unnecessary when you have loops. A loop is a way of taking a bit of code, like this bit here, and repeating it multiple times. Here's how we're going to do that. I'm going to use a while loop, and I'm going to teach two different kinds of loops today. I'm going to make a while loop, which has the same basic structure as an if statement. You have the keyword while, you have a condition in these parentheses, and code to execute in here. And it's almost exactly like an if statement because an if statement has a keyword, a condition, and code to execute. The only difference is the code inside of here being executed will always be executed as long as this condition is true. Whereas in an if statement, this code would only get run exactly once. So we know what code we want to run repeatedly. We want to run this code repeatedly. So I'm going to paste it here. That's the code we want to run repeatedly, but what is our condition? When do we need to stop this while loop? Well, we need to stop it once counter reaches 101. So I can put two different conditions in here. I could say we're going to run this loop as long as counter is less than 101. And that would give us our results. If I save and refresh, it starts at 1 and goes all the way to 100. Another way, I could simply check to make sure that counter is not equal 101, and that will give you the exact same results here, numbers 1 to 100. So we have this condition here, and then we have code to execute here. And what's very important is that this counter is being updated. If I forgot to do this, if I forgot to update the counter would stay at 1. 1 would always not be 101. And so this section will run forever. And so that's not going to break anything, but your website's going to freeze up, and you're going to either have to close the tab or close the entire browser because it really starts freezing up and slowing down when you have an infinite while loop here. You don't want an infinite while loop. So that's why we update counter inside the while loop. And you can see this is way better than just copying and pasting this code repeatedly. This is very efficient. If I wanted to make it up to 1,000, I could do that very easily by just adding an extra digit here. And we would print the numbers 1 to 1,000 at almost the exact same speed too. So loops in general are really important to programming. Though I want to teach the other kind of loop, there's also a for loop. And there's a specific reason I want to use that one instead. A for loop has a different structure. So you have the keyword, parentheses, and the curly brackets. But the for loop inside of here, you do not just put one condition, you actually put three things. So what you do in a for loop is first you create a variable. So I'm going to call it I, since most people call the for loop variable I. There's nothing special about I. This is just a variable. It could be called something else. And when I was programming or learning to program, I didn't know this. I thought the variable always had to be I. But it can be anything. You create a variable and you're going to set it to something. Well, if I want to print out the numbers 1 to 100, then I'm going to start with 1. So I equals 1. I'm going to add a semicolon. The next statement you need in a for loop, and I said there were three, the next one is your condition. Where does I stop? Well, I is going to go, we're going to keep running as long as I is less than 101. And the final statement is your update statement. What happens after every iteration, that just means repeat, of the for loop? Well, after every iteration, we're just going to add one to I. So now I can simply put console.log I. And what's happening? I starts as 1. The for loop runs as long as I is less than 101. We add 1 to I after every iteration. And I commented this out, so we just get the for loop, and we get the same thing, the numbers 1 to 100. Now, why this method? This method seems a little bit more complicated than the while loop. The while loop's just one condition. Well, the for loop is a little bit more complicated because you got three things inside the parentheses here. But a for loop, there's a clear distinction between a while loop and a for loop. In the task I gave, printing the numbers 1 to 100, I knew exactly that there were 100 times we would need to execute the console.log code. Exactly 100 times. And because I knew it was exactly 100 times, I can use a for loop. For loops are incredibly useful for when you need to execute code a certain amount of times. And often, like if you wanted to only execute code 10 times, you could do, or you can start I as 0, I is less than 10. This will give me the number 0 to 9. 0 to 9. If you want to execute something an exact number of times, a for loop is the best loop to use. A while loop, you don't know how long you want to run the code, you just want to run it as long as the condition is true. A good example, let's say we had a video game, and we have a player dead variable, which is false. I know that I do not want the game to keep running once a player dies. So imagine this is our game loop. The whole game runs as long as player dead is false. And inside of here, I'm just going to put play game. You can use your imagination and imagine all our game code is in there. What's going to happen is our game's going to keep running. Everyone's going to keep moving, updating, rendering over and over and over again. But once the player is dead, then this will execute. You don't know when the player will die. You don't know if it's going to be after 10 frames or 100 or 1,000. The player could die at any time, which is why you use a while loop. A while loop is good for when you do not know when your condition is no longer true. So that's the difference between a while loop and a for loop. And that's also the end of this video. We're going to be using a for loop in the next video. One more thing, actually, before I stop the video, I want to show more for loop examples. So in the example we did earlier, we just went from 1 to 100 and we printed out all those numbers. But I want to show you can do a lot more than just that with a for loop. So if you wanted to print the numbers 100 to 1, we could start I as 100. We go as long as I is greater than 0. If we did greater than 1, then it would stop at 2. So we're going to do greater than 0. And instead of I plus plus, I minus minus. And if you run that, you get 100 to 1 just by flipping things around. I starts as 100, I is greater than 0, I minus minus. So for loops are not just for incrementing up. Let's try to do every other number. For, and I'm gonna type let I. I don't think I've taught the difference between let and var, but for now, that let is another way of creating a variable, just like var, and I'll try to explain the difference in another video. But typically with for loops, I use let because this variable I is a temporary variable, and I'm not going to be using it anywhere else. So I'm going to change this to let as well. That's kind of what you use let for, temporary variables. For let I be, I'm going to start I at 0, and what we're going to do is we're going to do 1 to 100, but just the even numbers. I, it has to be less than 101. I plus equals 2. So we're going to be doing all the even numbers from 0 to 100. So when I console.log, when I print out I, not 9, I0, we're going as long as I is less than 101. We're adding 2 each time. And this runs, oh, we still have the other loop from before. I'm going to comment this out so we don't get all the numbers in the output. We get 0, excuse my alarm, we get 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way to 100. You could also do this by fives. We could start at 0, go as long as I is less than 101, and then we add 5 every time. Like that. And again, it keeps running much shorter. Let's add 10 this time, and we're going to exactly get 10 different frames, or actually 11 since we started at 0. And it gets shorter and shorter. So I just want to show you more options that you can do with a for loop, as well as introduce let. Let is basically you want to use these for temporary variables that you don't really plan on using elsewhere. And that is my summary of it. I believe I will be covering let more extensively later.